So, welcome back to this series for the OurTor blog on myths and legends, professionals in their field talking about what the importance of myths and legends are and their favourite myth or legend. So today we are interviewing Adrian Beckingham, or also known as Man from Story Mountain, who is a professional storyteller and author of several books, mostly kids books, so we're going to chat with him today. So thank you very much for joining us today. Can you tell a little bit more about yourself?
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me here, Tor. My pleasure. I began storytelling in the mid-1990s, so we're talking about 25 years ago. My first storytelling ever was actually a professional show in that I was being paid to do it. I was brought in to do that storytelling by an old man, about 70 years old, who I had seen storytelling in a Dorset library. I'd actually gone up to him at the end of the show. He was just there telling a story to young children, and I said to him, "That was amazing." Now, he would get that regularly, as any performer, whatever your art form is. If you're decent at what you do, you'll have people come and say that was great at the end of some shows. So that was nothing unusual for him, but he kind of picked me out from his crowd of many years of storytelling, because when I said to him that was great, he literally got his finger and poked me in the chest like that, and he said, "You're going to be a storyteller." And I said, "No, that's not what I meant, mate. I just meant that was really great." Anyway, we swapped numbers, because he seemed a nice old man, and I was newly arrived in the area. And 6 months later, he rang me up and said, "Oh, look, I've got you a paid job as a storyteller. I've got you a gig." And I said, "Oh, well, no thanks, you know." He said, "Oh, no, you've got to." I said, "Look, I couldn't. It's not me, you know. People would get bored. I wouldn't be very good at it." He kept on insisting. I had my first child on the way. His mum was pregnant from my son Sage, and she said, "Look, you know, earn you a little bit of money, go and try it." So I went and gave it a go, and I created 2 stories. I've always been writing, I've never been storytelling, and so I found out that the show was going to be in Portland Castle. That's there in Dorset, near Weymouth, and it was an English heritage castle. So I rang up the castle and I said, "What sort of castle are you?" And she said, "Oh, we're a Tudor castle." Now, having been brought up in Australia, I'd never even heard the word Tudor before. It could have been a type of flower or a type of architecture or a type of anything. So I started really from scratch, created a story, I wrote a story with some Tudor facts in it, and off I went and told my first story. I had one in the bag as well in case I needed to do 2. I visited the castle beforehand and saw that they usually did shows of about 5 to 10 minutes, and then the crowd would move on to a different activity, maybe costume or cannon firing or whatever. I didn't realise on my evening of my first ever show that I was the event, and I was meant to put on a 90-minute performance, and I had about 10 minutes worth of material. And after I told my second very short story, it's only when everybody was sat there I realised, oh God, actually no one's moving. I'm not about to have a different audience. These guys, I was really aware of the fact they turned up as families to have an evening out, and unfortunately for them, they'd been landed with me. And I still remember, even though it's 25 years ago, one kid put up his hand and he said, "Hey, do you know any dragon stories?" Which I didn't. I could have thrown him out the castle window because I thought, God, that puts me on the spot. But I started to tell one, and that story dragged on and on and on for about an hour, and I was just ad-libbing, and everybody stayed and everybody watched. And
maybe that's why they call them drag-ons.
Drag-on, that's it. It was a drag-on story. It really, truly was. And I was very fortunate because David James, this old storyteller who got me my gig, he'd said, "Look, ask to be paid at the end and they'll give you a check. If you walk out the door and you don't ask to be paid, you can probably wait about 3 months, so make sure you do. So there it was, and I was waiting to get my fee for the evening, and the lady, her name was Antoinette, she was just handing me this check, and her phone rang, and she went and answered. 10 minutes later she came back and she went, oh, that was Carol White, who at that point in time I knew none of these names, but she was the director of Southwest English Heritage, and she just rung to say, do you know any storytellers? We've got 12 castles we need a storyteller for. So Antoinette said, would you like to do the 12 castles? I was like, wow, okay, yeah. And I just arrived in the UK, so I thought, brilliant. And I got to travel all around the southwest telling stories in castles, which after that I didn't look back. I just kept going.
Cool. So, being a storyteller, is it? Do you think it's something that everybody has in them, a possibility?
I think an awful lot of life is stories, and people are always telling stories. Stories about what they've heard, stories about what they've seen, what they've done, what happened that day, what their dream was, things they'd like to aspire to, things that have really upset them. They're all stories. I mean, life is one great big storyboard, really. And I think by actually storytelling with awareness, that helps people sometimes focus on the fact that you can, to some extent, be your own storyteller, your own script writer. And if you see a story unfold in your own life because you've done it with intention, that can be very empowering rather than walking forward blindly with no idea what you think you want to do. So storytelling, I think, is not only innate in everybody, but also very valuable to everybody if people choose to harness it.
And what do you think the importance of myths and legends are in people's world?
Well, myths are archetypes. They're a way of, often through metaphor or analogy, they're creating a sort of what-if scenario or this happened framework, and sometimes it can be taken very clinically, as in, oh, this really happened, by some people, and other people may rubbish that myth. And of course there is the general use of the word myth. You go, oh, that's a myth. That means it's not true, it's a myth. But that is a real misnomer, because there really is a lot of truth within myths, and myths were created because they hold a central core of something valuable and important. And that's why the sort of myths we're talking about, the myths within storytelling, why they're there, why they've been created, and indeed why they've been passed on through generations. And that's when we get into legends, because if, you know, something or someone is a legend, that is a real build-up. You know, wow, they're a legend, or that was a legend, you know, event. It means it was fantastic, incredible, and something to aspire to. And that is what legends and myths do. They're there to inspire us and to give us possibilities of what we could work with within our own lives.
So a number of years ago you wrote a very amazing book called Stories That Crafted the Earth. Can you tell us what the inspiration of that book was?
Well, although I was born in the UK, travelled out to Australia when I was 3, which was a good stroke of luck for me. It was a lovely place to grow up. But one thing that always disturbed me as a young child, I'd walk to school every day, and I had to walk through at the corner of a park, and there was a large stone slab sat there. It wasn't placed there by anyone, it was just a natural stone that had literally been there for thousands of years, but it had these 2 kangaroos carved into it, and people just walk over this stone all the time. And I was really intrigued, because who made these kangaroos? Who carved them into that rock? And I remember in primary school, you know, probably the one lesson I really remember from primary school was when we suddenly pulled out this, you know, picture book with a bit of information about, oh, these are the Aborigines, these were the original inhabitants, And there were some coloured pictures there of little black stick figures waving around spears, and they said, oh, they used to live in Australia. But then the real history began and the white settlers came. And that was the end of Aboriginal focused education when I went to primary school. And that always stayed inside of me. Had it not been for that rock I walked past every day, it might have just gone over my head. But I always had this desire to learn more about Indigenous people. And as soon as I was an adult rather than a school child, that was one of my quests. I want to find out more about Aboriginal people. I actually studied for a while Aboriginal society in my first year university. I then went on to work with different Indigenous groups around the globe. And it wasn't focused on stories, it was focused on land rights and human rights. But through doing that, I'd hear these stories bubble up, and they just fascinated me, and I had a real desire to learn more and more of them. And then when I moved back to live in the UK, the country of my birth, I realised that it was quite difficult for me at that time. There's no internet yet. The internet had been invented by the mid-90s, but people didn't have computers sat at home, and it certainly wasn't on a phone. A phone was a thing that was connected to a wall with numbers on a dial, so it was hard to research unless you really went into a library, and the library would say, oh, we don't have any books on Indigenous people. It's a bit of an obscure subject. So, things have come a long way since then. So I decided to put in a bid to an organisation that doesn't exist anymore called Southwest Arts, which was part of the Arts Council, and I put forward an argument that, it's really hard to get any stories about Indigenous people, and they accepted that argument. They agreed it was very hard to get stories on that theme. So I said, great, well, therefore, would you guys please give me a grant? And they gave me a Writers at Large grant, and my project was called Stories That Crafted the Earth, and the theme was Indigenous people and their stories about the first trees, rivers, mountains, where did the first stars come from, first animals, where did the first people come from. And I was, fortunate, but sometimes in life we're given luck, and sometimes in life we make luck. And I think this was one of those instances where I made my luck.
So could you tell us what your favourite myth or legend is?
That's actually for me quite a difficult question. It's much easier to answer, I suppose, what my favourite genre of myths and legends are, because I'm a real fan of stories in general. I tell stories from all sorts of different themes and nations and different age groups stories, but if I was to select my favourite genre, it would have to be the Earth creation stories, as they're shown in the anthology Stories That Crafted the Earth, simply because I love stories that go back as far as they can into our ancestral roots. While there's a lot of fantastic new stories being penned this very day, no doubt, and literature and storytelling is full of fantastic examples of empowering stories, or stories that teach us things about ourselves or other peoples. The stories that are really genuinely passed on originally across the firesides, and now through more modern means, that human beings have been touched by enough to remember and pass on as elders, and then the children or young people, young adults who hear them are touched by the story so much that when they're also elders, they pass it on. Now, that's a story that's important for some reason to the human psyche and the human soul. And with the Earth creation stories, we're looking at stories that are tens of thousands of years old. It's wonderful to see and hear and understand how people who lived so very, very long ago understood the creations of the world and held those stories at such a high level of value that in tens of thousands of years they never got dropped. That ball never got dropped. They didn't end up being forgotten. They are what they were all those years ago, and we could have a long conversation about artifacts that can prove what story said which, and but those stories, they're fantastic. And I've worked with earth creation stories inside prisons where the audiences are all murderers, and I've worked with those stories inside of mental health situations, for example, for 7 years continuously with the mental health charity Mind, and you see people coming to those sessions who literally transform, not always through one telling, though one telling can transform a person, but when people make themselves familiar, just take themselves to hear those stories and work with those stories, they really do have a medicinal power, which is why often they're called medicine stories. And the stories in creation, stories that crafted the earth, they are viewed often as medicinal stories, and I'm very certain of the fact that they do carry that energy, so I'd have to put them down as my favourite.
Yeah, I think that point is so apt. How ancient these stories are, that they go back, tens of thousands, but maybe even longer than that. Because you're talking about the creation myths of the world, and that goes back millions of years. And it's as if these stories are being told by people that witnessed it and saw it happening. And it's very shamanic, that this idea, this timeless idea that you could see how the world was created and kind of talk about and kind of vision how that might have happened, and symbolically. And I really like what you were talking about earlier about how the difference between a myth and a legend, that actually the myths are like folklore. They are these stories that are timeless. That could be millions of years old, and how they are reinvented, like our nursery rhymes and our fairy tales. They're recreated of ancient stories that are or could be even millions of years, not only tens of thousands of years old, but they're brought up to date. And we've lost that culture, that medicine, story culture, the shamanic culture. Druidism has pretty much vanished in this country. But if we were still, and maybe hopefully we will go back there, and maybe it is the storytellers that will take us back there, that these ancient stories will be remolded for an audience now. Because sadly, it seems that stories have been kind of downplayed recently and put aside, made silly. They're just for children, but they're not. They're not for children. Like you say, they're for everybody, from cultures all over, murderers through to mental health patients. And the importance of those stories, actually to get people out of their mind and into their heart again, and into their creativeness. Say, wow, I can be creative. I can flow with this. I can make these stories come real. It's like making your dreams come real. It's about connecting to your dreams and knowing and kind of realizing the stories and the knowledge that are coming through your dreams. Probably the original stories came from dreams, of that people were having, because that's how that knowledge is being told to people through their dreams, through their subconscious, their unconscious mind, and that comes out. And the best way to bring it out is through stories. You can't rationalize the conscious, the kind of subconscious, healing, shamanic, magical mind. You can't rationalize it and say, oh, it's this and this with figures and this and numbers and this and that, like that. That's stuff that is all happening right now. But I think we're going back into that time where there is a place and there is a importance for stories and that the healing of that.
Well, the shamanic essence of stories is not in itself being depleted. So I totally agree with you. Or 20 years ago, I would have totally agreed with you that the art of storytelling had very much faded. And when that old guy, David James, grabbed me and pointed his finger in my chest and said, "You're going to be a storyteller," and he was right, and I became one a little bit with his help, because he was my first door that was open, then I was a storyteller. And when I'd say to people, "I'm a storyteller," you know, when you're in a social gathering, and say, "Oh, what do you do?" I'd go, "Oh, I'm a storyteller." People would always say the same thing. This is 25 years ago. They'd say, "What's that?" Or they'd say, alternatively, "No, I meant your job." Now, either of those things, I'd go, "Yeah, I know you meant my job. That is my job. And what's a storyteller? It's telling stories." "Oh, what does that mean?" Now, that was 25 years ago. Now, there's a lot of storytellers. It's a very long time since someone's asked me, what does storytelling mean? So it is really having a revival in just the common person's awareness of what a storyteller is and what stories do. And from the point of view of the, if you like, shamanic quality of stories eroding or not eroding, some of my favourite stories in those creation myths that are tens of thousands of years old at least can be used in a very magical and very specific way. For example, a story I learned from the Blackfoot Native American people. Takes about an hour and a half to tell. I've told it 4 times in my life, because when I was given this story, I was actually told, "Don't ever tell this story more than fingers you've got on your hand." Well, I've got 5 fingers on one hand, and I'm up to 4 tellings. And the magical thing about this particular story, which is about 90 minutes long to tell properly, is I was told that when you say the last word of the story, it's going to open up the clouds and bring out the sun. And the clouds won't just kind of gradually melt away. They'll open like a circle with the sun in the middle. And that has happened each time, 4 out of 4, that I've told the story. The last time was some years ago at a very wet Glastonbury festival, and I sat in a big lodge teepee, and I said to everybody, "Right, we're all soaking wet, I'll bring out this story that I almost never tell." And I'm told that on the last word, which is about 90 minutes from now, the sun will open up the clouds in a big circle. And I always say, "I'm not telling you it's going to happen. Let's give it a test run, shall we?" And sure enough, as I said the last word with this teepee full of people, we felt the sun beam down through the canvas, and some people ran outside, and sure enough, the clouds were opening up in a big circle. There's other examples, a beautiful story by the Kwakwaka'wakw people, who are both Native American and Native Canadian. The Kwakwaka'wakw being the raven of many colours, shining bright as the sun. Now that story, I was told, if you honour it and you tell it often, then when you've lost something, it could be a set of keys that you've lost. If you find that you've lost something, you can ask Raven, the great gatherer, the finder of lost objects. Raven who flapped your wings and made the wind that made the world. Raven who watched the first people being born from the elderberry trees. Raven who gathered the leaves and turned them into salmon, and it goes on and on. If you know the sequence of what to say, then if you've lost something, if you're just straight away and you're kind of lazy and you try and call on Raven to find it, he's not bothered. The Kwakwaka'wakw won't listen. But if you've looked and looked and looked to a point of real frustration, then you ask the Kwakwaka'wakw with the correct linkage of the story what they say. What the Kwakwaka'wakw, Native American, Native Canadian people say is that ask Kwakwaka'wakw and then you will find whatever it is you've lost. And you won't walk around looking for it. Stay in the spot where you've asked Kwakwaka'wakw and just cast your eyes around and you will find it. Now that didn't have like the Blackfoot story that said never tell it more than a number of fingers on your hand. That wasn't a condition with Kwakwaka'wakw, and I've used that story. I don't have to tell the whole 90-minute story. I, as someone who practices the story regularly, can simply ask Kwakwaka'wakw with the correct linkage to find the object. I've never had it fail. And my family, my children, they've all seen me do this and they have complete faith in it. So that's talking about the shamanic quality of stories. I mean, if you can ask for something using a story and that something appears as though by magic in front of you, that's the quality of storytelling.
Yeah.
There you go.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Adrian, and yeah, really fascinating information. So.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Tor. Always a pleasure.